Why was no one looking at her? The morning sun sliced through the windows of Fort Richardson's mess hall, casting long shadows across rows of metal tables where soldiers gathered for breakfast. The clatter of trays, the buzz of 100 conversations, the familiar symphony of military life humming along like it did every morning. But something was different today. Someone new had walked through those doors. She moved through the breakfast line with the kind of calm that didn't announce itself, didn't demand attention. Her uniform was crisp, properly fitted, regulation perfect. But it was the way she carried herself that caught the eye. Most newcomers either tried to disappear into the crowd or walked with that forced confidence that screamed inexperience. She did neither. She just existed, with a quiet certainty that felt earned rather than performed. Private Martinez noticed her first. He nudged Thompson, a subtle gesture across their table. "New arrival," he muttered, his eyes tracking her movement through the line. Thompson glanced over, taking in her youthful face, the way she selected her food with careful deliberation. "Looks young," he said, keeping his voice low. "But there's something about the way she moves. Something that didn't quite add up." Sarah Chen was 28, though her face suggested she might be younger. But faces lie. Experience doesn't. She had seen more in her years than most soldiers twice her age would ever witness, had walked into situations that would break hardened veterans, had made decisions in moments where hesitation meant death. Not that anyone here knew that. Not yet. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She moved through the line selecting practical foods, things that would sustain energy, not comfort foods or indulgences. Old habits. When you've gone days without knowing when your next meal might come, you learn to choose differently. You learn to think ahead always. Sergeant Davis watched from his corner table. 15 years of service had taught him to read people quickly, a survival skill in the military where understanding your teammates could mean the difference between coming home or not. But this woman puzzled him. Her movements were economical, purposeful, suggesting extensive training. The kind of training that takes years to develop, not months. Yet she looked barely old enough to have finished basic. It didn't make sense. "What do you think, Sarge?" Corporal Williams asked, following his gaze. "New transfer," Davis nodded slowly, still studying her. "Has to be, but from where, she's got that look about her, like she's seen things." The mess hall continued its rhythm, but something had shifted. An undercurrent of curiosity spreading through the room like ripples across water. It wasn't unusual for new personnel to arrive. Transfers happened all the time. But there was something about this particular arrival that felt different. Maybe it was the contrast between her youthful appearance and that ancient calm in her eyes. Maybe it was the way she seemed aware of everything without appearing to look at anything directly. Whatever it was, it had captured attention. Sarah felt their eyes on her. Of course she did. Years of training had sharpened her awareness to a razor's edge. She knew exactly how many people were watching, could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing against her from all directions. But she gave no sign of noticing. She had learned long ago that showing awareness of surveillance only confirmed its effectiveness. So she moved naturally, unhurried, selecting a table near the window where she could see the base beyond while appearing focused on her meal. She sat down and began to eat with deliberate care. Never rush a meal when you don't know when the next one might come. Another lesson learned in places most of these soldiers would never see, doing things they would never have to do. The conversations around her gradually returned to normal topics: weekend plans, training complaints, the usual grind of military life in peacetime. But she remained aware of the occasional glance, the whispered speculation. It was human nature. People wonder about newcomers, especially in the tight-knit world of a military base where everyone eventually knows everyone. As she ate, Sarah allowed herself to observe. The mess hall was typical of every military facility she'd encountered across the world. Functional, not comfortable. Designed to feed masses efficiently, not provide ambience. Yet there was something reassuring in its familiarity. Some things remained constant no matter where you went. The soldiers around her ranged from fresh-faced recruits still carrying that new enlistee enthusiasm to weathered veterans whose faces told stories their mouths would never speak. The eternal cycle, the young learning from the old watching the young and remembering. From her window seat she could see portions of the base beyond, morning sun climbing higher promising a clear day. She wondered what waited for her here, what challenges, what tests, her thoughts interrupted by movement, a shift in the room's energy. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had entered the mess hall, his eyes scanning the space with purpose. Their gazes met briefly across the crowded room. Recognition flashed across his features. She had been expecting this, had been ready since her arrival the previous evening. Morrison moved through the maze of tables deliberately, conversations quieted as he passed, soldiers straightening instinctively. The base commander rarely appeared during regular meal times. His presence changed the atmosphere immediately. As he approached her table, Sarah continued eating at her normal pace, though every fiber of her being was alert, ready. She had learned never to show nervousness, never show uncertainty, especially not in front of other soldiers who would be watching for weakness, for any crack in the armor. "Mind if I join you?" Morrison asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Not at all, sir," Sarah replied, her voice carrying that crisp confidence that had become second nature. As Morrison settled into his seat, the entire mess hall seemed to hold its breath. This was unusual, highly unusual. The base commander sitting with an unknown soldier, every person in that room straining to hear what might be said. The normal background noise of conversation and clinking utensils dropped to barely a whisper. Morrison studied her for a moment before speaking. "I received some interesting reading material yesterday evening. Reports about someone with your qualifications don't cross my desk every day." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. This wasn't the time or place for detailed discussion. She could feel dozens of eyes upon them, each person desperate to understand what was unfolding. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office after you finish your breakfast," Morrison suggested, his tone professional but carrying an undertone that made it clear this wasn't entirely a request. "Of course, sir," Sarah agreed, taking another measured bite. Morrison stood, causing a ripple of renewed attention throughout the room. Before leaving, he paused, looking down at her. "Welcome to Fort Richardson. I think you'll find your time here quite interesting." As the base commander departed, the mess hall erupted in whispered speculation. Every soldier present had just witnessed something unusual, though none could quite put their finger on what it meant. But one thing was clear. This newcomer was far more than just another routine transfer. Sarah finished her breakfast with the same calm deliberation, seemingly oblivious to the intense curiosity she had generated. She was accustomed to speculation, had learned to navigate it with patience and wisdom that came from experience, not age. When she finally stood, collecting her tray, conversations paused again, eyes following her as she made her way to the disposal area, then toward the exit. She walked with that same quiet confidence, that same economical grace. And in her wake, she left a mess hall full of questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had Morrison seen in those reports that made him seek her out personally? But there was something else, something she hadn't told them, not yet, something that would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet young woman who had walked into their world that morning. The answers would come, but not today, not in the way any of them expected. What had she been doing for the past 36 hours? Morrison's office was exactly what Sarah expected. Functional, organized, displaying the personality of a career military officer who valued efficiency over aesthetics. Citations on the wall, a map of the region, family photos carefully arranged on one corner of the desk. The window behind him overlooked the training grounds where soldiers were already beginning their morning exercises. Morrison gestured to a chair across from his desk. Sarah sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Patience was a weapon she had mastered long ago. "Colonel Chen," Morrison began, and just like that the first card was on the table, her rank. Spoken aloud in a room where the walls might be thin, where someone might be listening. But Morrison was careful. He had swept his office for surveillance devices that morning. She knew because she had watched him do it from across the quad using binoculars from her temporary quarters, always aware, always watching. "I apologize for the informal introduction," he continued, "but I thought it prudent to observe before making contact." "No apology necessary, sir," Sarah replied. "I would have done the same," and she meant it. In fact, she had been counting on it. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating personnel. "Your file is impressive, Delta Force. 3 tour in classified locations. Specialized training in counterintelligence, tactical operations, and crisis management. Decorated multiple times, though most of those commendations are sealed. You're 28 years old, and you've already accomplished more than most officers achieve in a full career." Sarah said nothing. Let him talk. Let him reveal what he knew, what he thought he knew, and what he was guessing at. Information flowed in silence as much as in words. "The question," Morrison continued, "is what brings an officer of your caliber to Fort Richardson. We're important, certainly, but we're not exactly a hotbed of classified operations." "That's not entirely accurate, sir," Sarah said quietly. "Fort Richardson is about to become very important." Morrison's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of a suspicion. "I received preliminary briefings about a potential security operation. Is that why you're here?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir, but it's more than potential. Intelligence indicates hostile foreign actors have begun targeting this facility specifically. The operation is active. It's happening now." The weight of those words settled between them. Morrison had commanded bases before, had dealt with security threats, but this was different. This was his base, his personnel, and the threat was already in motion. "How serious?" he asked. Sarah appreciated his directness. "No panic, no posturing, just the need to know. Serious enough that they sent me, and serious enough that we need to move carefully. The enemy has demonstrated sophisticated surveillance capabilities and infiltration techniques. Which is why I arrived the way I did." Morrison understood immediately. "You've been observing, assessing vulnerabilities from the inside." "For 36 hours, Sarah confirmed. "Walking through the base as an unknown new arrival, watching how personnel interact, identifying potential security gaps, evaluating readiness. It's been educational." There was something in her tone that made Morrison lean forward. "What did you find?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Your people are good, sir, professional, disciplined, aware, but they're not prepared for what's coming. They're trained for conventional threats, standard protocols. This operation requires something different. It requires them to think like intelligence operatives, not just soldiers, and it requires leadership they'll trust completely." Morrison absorbed this, understanding the implications. "How do you want to proceed?" "I need to reveal my identity and mission to key personnel," Sarah said, "but on my terms, in a way that demonstrates the seriousness of the situation while building the trust necessary for success. I've already identified several individuals who will be crucial to the operation. Sergeant Davis, for one. He's observant, intelligent, and his people respect him. Corporal Williams shows initiative. Private Martinez has situational awareness beyond his rank." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "You learned all that in a day and a half." "That's what I do, sir," Sarah replied simply. "I watch, I listen, I understand people before they understand me. It's kept me alive in places where mistakes don't come with second chances." There was no bravado in her words, just fact, simple, cold fact. Morrison nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" Sarah appreciated that question. Not "what should I do" or "what are you going to do?" but "what do you need?" The mark of a good commander. Someone who understood that sometimes your job was to support rather than lead. "I need you to arrange a briefing," Sarah said. "Tomorrow morning, all personnel in the mess hall. Make it mandatory but keep the reason vague. Security update, procedural changes, something routine enough not to cause panic but important enough that everyone shows up." Morrison made notes on a pad. "Consider it done." "What else?" Sarah hesitated, not from uncertainty but from the weight of what she was about to say. "I need you to trust me, sir. What I'm about to do may seem unconventional. Some might say it's unorthodox, but it's necessary. The reveal has to happen in a specific way at a specific time to achieve the psychological impact needed. Morrison studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You have my trust, Colonel. Your record speaks for itself. And frankly, if they sent you, then this situation is serious enough that I'm going to defer to your expertise." Relief washed through Sarah, though she didn't show it. Command approval was crucial. Without Morrison's support, everything that followed would be exponentially harder. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." As Sarah stood to leave, Morrison spoke again. "Colonel Chen, those 36 hours you spent observing, what you saw in that mess hall walking through the base as an unknown soldier, that anonymity is gone now. Once you reveal yourself tomorrow, everything changes. Are you ready for that?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Sir, I've been ready since the moment I walked through those gates. The question isn't whether I'm ready. The question is whether Fort Richardson is ready for what comes next." She left his office with the same quiet confidence she had carried into it. But inside, her mind was racing, planning, calculating. The pieces were moving into position. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. Tomorrow morning, the quiet newcomer who had been observing from the shadows would step into the light, and Fort Richardson would learn that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you never see coming. How do you tell an entire base their lives are about to change? Sarah spent the rest of that day in careful preparation. She reviewed intelligence reports in Morrison's secure conference room, cross-referencing known threats with observed vulnerabilities. She analyzed personnel files, matching skills to potential roles in the operation. She mapped the base in her mind, identifying choke points, surveillance blind spots, potential infiltration routes. This was the work she excelled at, the invisible architecture of security and counter-security. The chess game played in shadows. But beneath the professional focus, something else stirred. Anxiety, if she was being honest with herself. Not fear of the mission or the threats they faced. She had confronted worse odds in darker places. This anxiety was different, more personal. It was the anxiety of revelation, of stepping from shadow into light. For 36 hours she had been invisible, just another face in the crowd, watching without being watched, learning without being known. There was safety in that anonymity, a kind of freedom she rarely experienced in her line of work. Tomorrow that freedom would end. Tomorrow she would become Colonel Sarah Chen in the eyes of everyone on this base, with all the expectations, assumptions, and judgments that came with that identity. She would become a symbol, a commander, someone to be obeyed, respected, maybe even feared, but also someone to be questioned, doubted, tested, especially given her age, her appearance, the disconnect between what she looked like and what she had done. She had faced this before. The surprise in people's eyes when they learned her rank, the skepticism, the subtle tests to see if she really knew what she was doing. Some people never got past it, never could reconcile the young face with the decorated record. But that was their limitation, not hers. She had learned to let their doubts fuel her determination, to prove herself not through words but through results, through the quiet competence that spoke louder than any defense she could mount. Evening fell. Sarah stood at the window of her temporary quarters, watching the base settle into its nighttime rhythm, lights flickering on in barracks, soldiers returning from training, from duties, from whatever had filled their day. Tomorrow, many of their lives would pivot, would move from routine to something more intense, more demanding. Some would rise to the challenge, others might struggle. Her job was to identify who was who, to place the right people in the right positions, to build a team capable of facing sophisticated threats. But it was also her job to care, to remember that these weren't just assets to be deployed. They were people, with families, fears, hopes, histories. They deserved leadership that saw them as more than tools, that recognized their humanity even while asking them to operate at the highest levels of professional performance. That balance was the hardest part of command, the line between mission focus and human compassion. Push too hard and you break people, too soft and the mission fails. Sarah thought about Sergeant Davis. He had been watching her in the mess hall with that assessing gaze of someone who had seen enough to know when something didn't fit. He would be valuable in the operation. His experience, his respect among the enlisted ranks, his instinct for reading situations. But could he accept taking orders from someone who looked barely older than the fresh recruits? Could he trust her judgment when the stakes were highest? She thought about the young soldiers she had observed, Martinez with his quick awareness, Thompson with his cautious intelligence, the dozens of others who made up the fabric of Fort Richardson's personnel. They were good at their jobs, trained, disciplined, professional, but this operation would demand more. It would demand they think differently, act differently, trust differently. Could she ask that of them? Could she inspire it? Sleep came reluctantly that night, Sarah's mind circling through scenarios, possibilities, potential complications. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were fragmented. Memories of other briefings, other missions, other moments when everything hung on getting the next steps exactly right. She woke before dawn as always. Old habits. In some parts of the world, dawn was the most dangerous time. When vision was poor, when guards were tired, when attacks came. She dressed with care, her uniform perfect, insignia polished, not vanity but necessity. When you revealed yourself as a colonel, you needed to look the part. Every detail mattered. Every signal you sent through appearance, posture, tone. She studied herself in the mirror. The face looking back was young, yes, but the eyes were old. That was the disconnect people struggled with. The ancient awareness in those eyes that had seen too much, learned too much, carried too much. The walk to the mess hall felt longer than it was, each step bringing her closer to the moment of transformation, from observer to leader, from unknown to known. The early morning light was soft, gentle, the kind of light that felt deceptive in its beauty, because beautiful mornings could hide ugly truths, could mask the dangers waiting just beyond the horizon. Morrison was already there when she arrived. He nodded to her, a gesture of respect and solidarity. "Everyone's assembling," he said quietly. "They think it's a routine security briefing, standard procedure stuff." Sarah nodded. Good. The reveal would have more impact that way, when people expected routine and encountered reality instead. She could hear them gathering, the shuffle of boots on floor, the murmur of voices, soldiers filing in, finding seats, settling with that particular energy of people attending a mandatory meeting they'd rather skip. They had no idea, no concept of what was about to unfold, and in that ignorance there was a kind of innocence that Sarah almost regretted having to shatter. But the mission demanded it. The threats were real, the stakes were high, and Fort Richardson needed to be ready, even if it meant forcing them to confront realities they had been sheltered from, even if it meant asking more of them than they had bargained for when they woke up that morning. Morrison stepped to the front of the room. Sarah remained to the side, still not fully visible to everyone, waiting. The room quieted, hundreds of eyes focused forward, waiting for another boring security update, another reminder about protocols and procedures. Instead, they were about to meet the person who would change everything they thought they knew about their base, their mission, and themselves. What happens when the mask finally drops? Morrison's voice cut through the remaining whispers. "Good morning. Thank you all for assembling on short notice." The tone was professional, measured, giving nothing away. "This morning's briefing concerns matters of base security and operational readiness. I'm going to turn this over to someone who will explain further." He gestured toward Sarah. "Colonel Sarah Chen." The reaction was immediate, heads turning, eyes widening, confusion rippling through the room like a wave hitting shore. "Colonel." That young woman from the mess hall, the newcomer they had been speculating about. Sergeant Davis sat straighter, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding. Corporal Williams exchanged glances with others nearby. Private Martinez's mouth opened slightly in surprise. Sarah stepped forward with deliberate calm. This was the moment, the reveal. Everything she had observed, everything she had learned over the past 36 hours came down to how she handled the next few minutes. She let the silence build, let them process, let the shock settle into something more focused. Finally, she spoke. "I know what you're thinking." Her voice carried clearly through the mess hall, not loud but penetrating, the kind of voice that commanded attention without demanding it. 2 days ago, you saw me walk into this mess hall for breakfast. A new face, someone you didn't recognize, someone you made assumptions about." She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room. "Some of those assumptions were correct, some weren't, but that's exactly why I'm here." The room was absolutely silent now, everyone leaning forward slightly, drawn in despite themselves. "For the past 36 hours, I've been conducting a security assessment of Fort Richardson, not from reports or briefings, but from inside, walking among you as an unknown soldier, observing how you interact, how you communicate, how aware you are of your surroundings, testing your readiness without you knowing you were being tested." She could see the reactions. Some looked impressed, others uncomfortable. A few seemed almost violated by the admission. All of them were riveted. "Why?" Sarah continued. "Because Fort Richardson has been identified as a target for hostile foreign intelligence operations. The threat is active, ongoing, and sophisticated, and my job is to ensure this base is prepared to counter that threat effectively." The weight of those words settled over the room like a physical presence. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't a drill. This was real. Over the next several weeks, we will be implementing enhanced security protocols. Some of you will be selected for specialized roles in the counterintelligence operation. Others will continue standard duties with modified procedures. But everyone, and I mean everyone, will play a part in ensuring the success of this mission. Sergeant Davis raised his hand. Sarah nodded to him. "Ma'am, when you say hostile foreign intelligence, are we talking about active infiltration attempts?" It was a good question. Direct, intelligent, exactly what an experienced NCO should ask. "Yes, Sergeant. We have evidence of surveillance, potential recruitment attempts, and efforts to compromise our security systems. The specifics are classified, but I want to be clear. This isn't hypothetical. This is happening now." More hands went up. Sarah pointed to Corporal Williams. "Colonel, how long have these operations been targeting us?" Sarah appreciated his phrasing. "Our base, not the base." He was already taking ownership. "Intelligence suggests initial surveillance began approximately 4 months ago. Activity has escalated in recent weeks, which is why I'm here now." A young private near the back spoke without being called on. "Why didn't anyone tell us sooner?" Sarah didn't reprimand the breach of protocol. The question was fair. "Because operational security required that we identify the full scope of the threat before revealing our awareness of it. If the enemy knew we were onto them, they would have changed tactics. We needed to observe their methods, understand their capabilities, before we could effectively counter them." She could see them processing this. The logic was sound, but it still stung. Being kept in the dark about threats to your own base, your own safety. But that was the reality of intelligence work. Sometimes protection meant withholding information, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. "I understand this is a lot to absorb," Sarah said, her tone softening slightly. "And I know some of you may feel frustrated that you weren't informed earlier, but I need you to understand something. The reason I spent the past 2 days observing you wasn't just about assessing vulnerabilities. It was about assessing capability, and what I found impressed me." She let that land. Let them hear the compliment beneath the criticism. "I watched Sergeant Davis maintain situational awareness even during routine activities. I saw Private Martinez identify unusual patterns in vehicle movements. I observed multiple instances of soldiers demonstrating exactly the kind of alertness and professionalism this operation requires. That's why I'm confident we can succeed." The energy in the room shifted, pride mixing with apprehension. They were being asked to step up, yes, but they were also being told they were capable, that they had already proven themselves in ways they hadn't even realized. Over the next 48 hours, personnel selections will be made. Those chosen for direct operational roles will receive additional briefings. Enhanced security protocols begin immediately, and I want to emphasize something crucial. Sarah's tone hardened. This operation succeeds or fails based on every single person in this room, maintaining the highest standards of security awareness and operational discipline. Morrison stepped forward. Colonel Chen brings extensive experience with these types of operations. Her record includes successful counterintelligence missions in multiple theaters. She's been selected specifically for this assignment because of her expertise. It was a subtle but important endorsement, Morrison lending his authority to hers, helping bridge the credibility gap her age might create. An older staff sergeant raised his hand. "Ma'am, what about our families? Are they at risk?" Sarah had been expecting this question, dreading it honestly, because the answer wasn't simple. Current intelligence suggests the threat is focused on base operations and personnel in their official capacities. However, we will be implementing additional security measures for base housing and providing briefings for family members on appropriate precautions. Your concerns for their safety are valid and will be addressed. The questions continued. Practical concerns about duty shifts, communication protocols, operational timelines. Sarah answered each one with patience and precision. This was the work beneath the work, building trust through transparency, demonstrating competence through calm, detailed responses, showing them that despite her age, despite the unconventional introduction, she knew exactly what she was doing. Finally, Morrison called the briefing to a close. Specific assignments and protocols will be distributed by 1600 hours today. Until then, maintain normal duties with enhanced awareness. Dismissed. As soldiers began filing out, their conversations were subdued but intense, processing everything they had learned. The casual atmosphere that had characterized their morning routine 2 days ago was gone, replaced by focused purposefulness. Sergeant Davis approached Sarah as the crowd thinned. He came to attention, was waved to a relaxed posture. "Colonel, I wanted to thank you for how you handled this. A lot of officers would have revealed their rank immediately, demanded different treatment." Sarah studied him. "Sergeant, effective leadership sometimes requires understanding your people before they understand you. The insights I gained over the past day and a half will make me a better commander for this operation." Davis nodded, understanding dawning. The uncomfortable feeling of being observed without knowing it suddenly made sense. It wasn't about distrust. It was about preparation. "Will there be opportunities for NCOs to take leadership roles in this operation?" he asked. "Absolutely," Sarah replied without hesitation. "This operation requires experienced NCOs in positions of significant responsibility. Your background and the leadership you've demonstrated will definitely be considered." As Davis departed, Sarah found herself alone in the mess hall except for Morrison and a man in civilian clothes she hadn't been introduced to yet. Morrison gestured to him. "Colonel Chen, this is Agent Wells from the intelligence community. He'll be working alongside us." Wells extended his hand. Sarah shook it, nodding the firm grip, the assessing eyes. "Another professional. Good." "How do you assess their readiness?" Morrison asked. Sarah considered carefully. "They're exactly what I hoped to find when I requested assignment here. Professional, intelligent, capable of handling responsibility. This operation has an excellent chance of success with personnel like these." Wells nodded. "The security assessments we've conducted support that evaluation. Fort Richardson has some of the best operational discipline we've encountered." Sarah took one last look around the mess hall. The space that had been the setting for quiet observation 2 days ago, for casual breakfast yesterday, for revelation this morning. It would be remembered, discussed. The moment everything changed. The quiet newcomer was gone now, replaced by Colonel Sarah Chen with all the authority and responsibility that identity carried. Outside, Fort Richardson was already changing. Enhanced security protocols taking effect, personnel beginning to prepare for new roles. The routine military life that had characterized the base was giving way to focused intensity, an active operation with national security implications. The transformation was complete. The real work was about to begin. Could she bridge the gap between who they expected and who she was? The next 72 hours blurred together in a controlled chaos of briefings, assessments, and implementation. Sarah worked from before dawn until well after midnight, meeting with key personnel, reviewing security protocols, coordinating with Agent Wells and his team. The base transformed around her. heightened alertness, additional checkpoints, modified procedures. Fort Richardson was waking up to realities it had been sheltered from. But beneath the operational intensity, Sarah felt the weight of scrutiny. The soldiers had accepted her authority. They followed orders. They showed respect. But she could sense the questions they didn't ask, the doubts they didn't voice. How could someone so young command an operation this critical? What had she really done to earn those classified commendations? Could they trust their safety to someone who looked like she belonged in a college classroom rather than a war zone? She had felt this before. The invisible barrier between appearance and capability, between assumption and reality. In Delta Force, she had proven herself through performance, through missions where success or failure was measured in lives saved or lost, through decisions made in split seconds where hesitation meant disaster. But here at Fort Richardson, most of these soldiers would never see that side of her, would never know the things she had done in places whose names couldn't be spoken. Sergeant Davis became her bridge. He had accepted her authority quickly, his initial skepticism giving way to professional respect, and where Davis led, others followed. He spoke to the enlisted ranks with the authority of experience, vouched for her competence, smoothed the rough edges of transition. Sarah appreciated it more than she could express. Good NCOs were the backbone of any military operation. Davis was better than good. One evening, 5 days into the operation, Sarah found herself in the base gym long after normal hours. She needed the physical release, the burn of exertion, the simplicity of movement. She was halfway through a punishing routine when she noticed Davis in the doorway. He didn't interrupt, just watched for a moment. Then he entered, moving to a different section of the gym to begin his own workout. They worked in silence for a while. The unspoken camaraderie of soldiers who understood the need to push their bodies to maintain edge to stay ready. Finally, Davis spoke between sets. "The younger enlisted are starting to come around, ma'am. They're impressed by your attention to detail, the way you remember names, notice things." Sarah continued her routine. "And the older ones," Davis paused. "They're waiting to see how you handle the first real crisis. It's not personal, it's just how it works." Sarah appreciated his honesty. "I understand. Trust is earned, not given." She finished her set, grabbed a towel. "Can I ask you something, Sergeant?" Davis nodded. "When you first saw me in the mess hall, what did you think?" He considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I thought you were lost, too young, too composed, something didn't fit, made me curious, made me watch closer." He met her eyes. "Now I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be, and that scares me a little." "Why?" Sarah asked. Davis smiled slightly. "Because people like you only get sent when the situation is worse than we're being told. When the brass thinks we need someone who's already survived impossible odds. So yeah, it scares me, but it also makes me feel better about our chances." The conversation shifted to operational details. Specific personnel who showed promise, potential vulnerabilities that needed addressing, areas where additional training might be needed. It was the kind of practical discussion that built working relationships. Two professionals focused on mission success, age and rank fading into background noise. Over the following weeks, Sarah's pattern became familiar to the base. She was everywhere, observing training exercises, reviewing security footage, meeting with small groups to discuss specific concerns. She didn't command from an office. She led from proximity, visible, accessible, always watching, always learning. The soldiers began to understand that her initial observation period hadn't been a one-time thing. This was how she operated: constant assessment, continuous adaptation. The breakthrough came during an unexpected security drill. Sarah had orchestrated it without warning. Simulated infiltration attempt at 300 hours, testing response protocols, response time, decision-making under pressure. Most of the base performed well, but one guard post showed concerning lapses. Sarah personally debriefed the soldiers involved, not with anger but with precision, breaking down what went wrong, why it mattered, what needed to change. One of the guards, a young private named Jackson, was visibly shaken. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I froze, I didn't know what to do." Sarah studied him, saw the genuine distress, the fear of having failed. Private Jackson, you know what's interesting about failure? Jackson shook his head. Failure is information. You learned something about yourself tonight. You learned that your current training hasn't prepared you for certain scenarios. That's valuable, because now we know what to work on. She spent the next hour personally walking Jackson through proper response procedures, not delegating it to someone else, not writing him off as a weak link, teaching. The other guards watched, saw their colonel taking time to ensure one private understood, saw her patience, her focus on improvement over punishment. Word spread through the base. The old-timers who had been waiting for her to show her true colors found something unexpected. She was tough, yes. Demanding, absolutely. But also invested in their success in a way that felt genuine. Corporal Williams approached her one afternoon during a training review. "Colonel, can I ask you something?" Sarah nodded. "How old were you when you deployed for the first time?" Sarah paused. The question was more personal than professional, but Williams had earned honesty. 22. I looked even younger than I do now. My team didn't trust me, thought I was a liability. I had to prove myself every single day for months before they accepted that I belonged. Williams absorbed this. "Did that make you angry?" Sarah considered. "Sometimes, but mostly it made me determined. I realized I could either resent their doubts or use them as fuel. I chose fuel." She met his eyes. "The same choice you make every time someone underestimates you because of your age or background or anything else. Anger or fuel, resentment or determination." The conversation rippled through the ranks. The colonel wasn't just some prodigy who had been handed opportunities. She had fought for every inch of respect, had faced the same doubts they were facing, and she had overcome them through competence and persistence. It made her human, relatable, someone they could believe in because she had walked the path they were walking. 6 weeks into the operation, Sarah received confirmation that the intelligence efforts were yielding results. Surveillance had been disrupted. Potential infiltration attempts had been identified and countered. The enhanced security protocols were working. Fort Richardson had become a significantly harder target. During a briefing with Morrison and Wells, Morrison leaned back in his chair. "You've done something remarkable here, Colonel. Not just the operational success, but the way you've transformed this base's culture. Soldiers are thinking differently, acting differently." Sarah shook her head slightly. "They were always capable of this, sir. They just needed someone to show them what they could be." It wasn't false modesty. She genuinely believed it. Her role hadn't been to create capability out of nothing. It had been to unlock potential that already existed, to provide direction and structure and belief. But she also knew the operation was far from over. The enemy was adapting, learning, probing for weaknesses. This was a long game, a chess match played across months or even years. Success today didn't guarantee success tomorrow. Vigilance couldn't fade. Standards couldn't slip. The moment they became comfortable was the moment they became vulnerable. That night Sarah stood at her window again, watching the base settle into nighttime rhythm. But it was different now than it had been those first nights. The lights weren't just lights anymore. They represented people she knew, soldiers she had trained with, briefed, learned from, Sergeant Davis running drills with his squad, Private Jackson standing watch with new confidence, Corporal Williams coordinating logistics with precision. They weren't just assets anymore. They were her team. And somewhere in that transformation from observer to leader, from unknown to known, Sarah had changed too. She had come to Fort Richardson as a decorated officer with an impressive record, but she was leaving each day as something more, as someone these soldiers believed in, trusted, would follow not because orders demanded it but because leadership inspired it. That was the gap she had bridged, not through rank or credentials but through presence, through caring, through seeing them as people, not just personnel. The work continued. The threats remained. But Fort Richardson was ready. And Colonel Sarah Chen had proven that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of trust earned one day at a time. What does it mean to lead when the stakes are life and death? 3 months into the operation, the call came. Intelligence had identified a high-confidence infiltration attempt planned for the following week. Specific targets, specific methodologies. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was the test. Everything they had prepared for, trained for, adapted for, was about to be put to the ultimate measure. Sarah assembled her core team in the secure briefing room. Sergeant Davis, Corporal Williams, Agent Wells, Morrison, and 8 other key personnel who had emerged as critical to the operation. The atmosphere was tense but focused. They had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it, but knowing and experiencing are different things. "The threat is real," Sarah began, her voice steady. "And it's imminent. I'm going to brief you on specific details that are highly classified. What you learn in this room stays in this room." "Understood," nods all around. She proceeded to lay out the intelligence. The enemy had identified what they believed was a vulnerability, a way to compromise the base's communication systems. They planned to exploit it during a scheduled maintenance window. If successful, they would gain access to classified information, personnel records, operational plans, everything. "We're going to let them try," Sarah said. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. She raised a hand for silence. "We're going to let them try, but we're going to control every aspect of what they find. We've prepared false data, dummy systems, information designed to mislead and misdirect. When they believe they've succeeded, they'll actually have walked into a trap that exposes their entire network." Sergeant Davis leaned forward. "That's a hell of a risk, ma'am. If something goes wrong, if they get past our safeguards, then we'll have failed," Sarah said bluntly. "But the alternative is playing defense forever, reacting instead of acting. This operation gives us a chance to turn the tables completely, to go from being hunted to being hunters." The debate that followed was intense, professional. These were people who had learned to challenge assumptions, to think critically, to voice concerns. Sarah had encouraged that culture, but ultimately the decision was hers, the responsibility was hers, and when the dust settled they all knew it. "We proceed as planned," she said finally, "but with additional contingencies. Corporal Williams, I need you coordinating backup systems. Davis, your team handles physical security during the operation. Wells, your people manage the intelligence feed. We run this tight, clean, and by the numbers." The days leading up to the operation were the longest of Sarah's career. Every detail checked and rechecked. Every contingency planned for. Every team member briefed and rebriefed until they could execute in their sleep. But beneath the operational focus, Sarah felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Fear. Not for herself, but for them. For Davis and Williams and Jackson and all the others who would be in harm's way because of her decision. She had made calls like this before. Had sent people into danger, but at Fort Richardson it felt different. These weren't just teammates. They were people she had watched grow, soldiers she had personally trained, men and women who trusted her judgment completely. The night before the operation, Sarah couldn't sleep. She walked the base in the early hours, checking on guard posts, reviewing final preparations. At one checkpoint, she found Private Jackson on duty. He had come so far since that failed drill, had transformed from a nervous rookie into a confident professional. "Everything quiet, Jackson?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am, all clear." Then, hesitantly, "Colonel, can I say something?" Sarah nodded. "Tomorrow's operation, I just want you to know. Whatever happens, we trust you, all of us. We know you wouldn't put us at risk unless it was necessary." The words hit harder than Sarah expected. She had earned their trust through months of work, through patience and teaching and leading by example. But now that trust meant they would follow her into danger, would risk their lives because she had decided this was the right move. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. "Thank you, Jackson," she managed. "That means more than you know." The operation commenced at 400 hours. Sarah positioned herself in the command center, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from multiple locations. Davis and his team were in place. Williams had backup systems ready. Wells was coordinating with external intelligence assets. Everything was set. Now came the hardest part: waiting, watching. The enemy made their move at 6:37 hours, exactly as predicted. They penetrated what they believed was the communication system, began extracting what they thought was classified data. Every second, Sarah watched, monitoring their progress, ensuring they stayed within the controlled pathway. One wrong turn and the entire operation could collapse. Then it happened, a deviation. The infiltrators weren't following the expected route. They had found something, a pathway that wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah's mind raced. How? They had mapped every possibility, controlled every access point, unless someone on the inside had created an alternate route, an actual vulnerability they hadn't known about. "Wells," she said sharply, "we've got a problem. They're accessing an uncontrolled sector." Wells was already moving, fingers flying across keyboards. "I see it. Someone created a backdoor, recent, within the last week." The realization hit like a physical blow. They had a mole. Someone with access had compromised the system. The enemy wasn't just exploiting a planned vulnerability. They had actual help from inside. Sarah had to make a decision, abort the operation, lock down everything, or adapt, use this unexpected development. "Davis," she spoke into the comms, "we may have a traitor on base. Heighten security immediately. No one leaves. No one accesses systems without direct authorization." To Wells, "Can we redirect them? Make them think that backdoor is giving them more than it is?" Wells worked frantically. "Maybe if we move fast." Sarah watched the monitors, watched her people moving into position, watched the enemy thinking they were succeeding. Every instinct screamed to shut it down, to protect her team. But if they aborted now, the mole would know they were compromised, would disappear, and they would be back to square one. "We continue," Sarah decided. "But controlled shutdown on my mark." Wells, prepare to isolate the backdoor, make it look like a system failure, not a countermeasure. The next 40 minutes were the most intense of Sarah's life, dancing on the edge of disaster, the enemy extracting data, her team tracking their movements, Wells building an electronic cage around them. And somewhere on this base, someone she had trusted, someone she had worked with, was betraying them all. Finally, the moment came. The enemy had taken enough bait, had exposed enough of their network. "Now," Sarah ordered, "shut them down. All teams execute." The response was immediate, systems locked, backup security activated, the enemy's access severed, but more importantly, their entire network was now exposed. Every connection they had made, every communication they had sent, all of it captured, recorded, traced. It was an intelligence windfall, a complete compromise of an enemy operation. The command center erupted in relieved celebration. They had done it. Against the odds, with an unexpected betrayal, they had succeeded. But Sarah felt no joy, only cold determination. "Wells, I need you to identify our mole. Use everything we just captured. I want a name in the next 6 hours." The investigation was methodical and ruthless. Wells and his team traced every system access, every communication, every anomaly. And 5 hours later, they had their answer: Specialist Reeves, a junior technician who had been recruited months ago, who had created the backdoor thinking he was being clever, thinking the enemy would pay him enough to disappear. He had no idea he had just made their operation more successful by forcing them to adapt in ways that exposed even more of the enemy network. Sarah personally arrested Reeves, read him his rights, watched MPs take him away. He was young, scared, realized too late what he had done. Part of her felt pity. He had made a terrible mistake, would pay for it for the rest of his life. But another part of her felt only anger. He had betrayed people who trusted him, had put lives at risk. There was no excuse for that. The operation's aftermath took weeks to fully process. Debriefings, intelligence analysis, coordination with other agencies. The data they had captured led to compromising enemy operations across multiple locations. Fort Richardson had struck a significant blow against hostile intelligence efforts. Morrison called Sarah to his office 6 weeks after the operation. "Colonel Chen, I've received word from command. Your mission here is complete. They're reassigning you to another critical operation." Sarah had been expecting this, knew it was coming, but it still felt abrupt, unfinished somehow. "When?" she asked. "2 weeks. They want you for final briefings and transition planning." The next 14 days felt surreal. Sarah walked the base she had transformed, spoke with soldiers she had trained, watched procedures she had implemented running smoothly. Fort Richardson wasn't the same base she had arrived at 4 months ago. It was stronger, sharper, more aware. And the people were different too. They carried themselves with confidence that came from having faced real threats and succeeded. Her final day, Sarah stood in the mess hall one last time, the space where it had all begun, where she had sat as an unknown newcomer, where she had revealed herself, where she had built trust one conversation at a time. Sergeant Davis found her there. "Thought I might find you here, ma'am," Sarah smiled. "It's where everything started, seemed right to end here too." Davis nodded. "I want you to know something, Colonel. When you first arrived, I wasn't sure about you. Young officer, big reputation coming in to shake things up. I thought maybe it was all hype." He paused. "I was wrong. You're the real deal, and you made all of us better." Sarah felt emotion rising but kept it controlled. "You were always capable, Sergeant, all of you. I just helped you see it." As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Richardson, soldiers lined up to say goodbye. Private Jackson standing taller now, Corporal Williams coordinating the farewell ceremony with precision. Dozens of others she had worked with, trained, learned from. Morrison presented her with a commendation. Words were spoken about her service, her leadership, her impact. But what Sarah would remember wasn't the ceremony or the award. It was the faces, the respect in their eyes. The knowledge that she had made a difference here, that these soldiers were ready for whatever came next because she had prepared them. As her vehicle pulled away from Fort Richardson, Sarah looked back one final time. The base that had tested her, challenged her, forced her to prove herself not through rank or reputation, but through daily demonstration of competence and care. She had arrived as an unknown observer, left as a trusted leader. The journey between those 2 points had been the hardest and most rewarding of her career. Somewhere ahead, another mission waited, another base that needed her skills, another group of soldiers who would doubt, then trust, then follow. That was her life, moving from crisis to crisis, building teams, solving problems, protecting people who would never know the threats she had shielded them from. It was exhausting, demanding, often thankless. But as Sarah settled in for the drive, she felt a deep sense of purpose. This was what she was meant to do. This was why she had endured the doubts and the skepticism and the constant need to prove herself, not for recognition or glory, but because she was genuinely good at it, because people like Sergeant Davis and Private Jackson deserved leadership that saw them as more than assets, because the work mattered. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. It shows up every day and does the work even when no one's watching. It proves itself through consistency rather than proclamation. It earns trust through patience rather than demands it through authority. Sarah had learned that lesson years ago in places whose names she couldn't speak, and she had lived it every day at Fort Richardson, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The base disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the people remained, stronger for having known her, ready for whatever came next, and that was enough, that was everything. That was the quiet victory of leadership done right, not measured in medals or promotions, but in lives improved, in teams strengthened, in soldiers who learned that they were capable of more than they had ever imagined, because someone took the time to show them, to believe in them, to lead them not with orders but with example. The road stretched ahead, new challenges waiting, but Sarah carried Fort Richardson with her, carried the lessons learned, the relationships built, the reminder that even in the hardest moments, even when the stakes were life and death, leadership was ultimately about one simple truth. People rise to the level of trust placed in them. Give them belief and they give you miracles. Expect excellence and they deliver it. See their potential and they become it. That was the real mission. Not the operations or the intelligence or the tactical victories, but the transformation of people into something greater than they knew they could be. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't technology or tactics, it's belief, belief in people, in their capability, in their worth. And when a leader carries that belief with absolute conviction, it becomes contagious, spreads through teams, transforms cultures, changes everything. Colonel Sarah Chen understood that, had lived it, and would carry it to the next mission, the next base, the next group of soldiers who needed someone to show them what they were truly capable of achieving. Because at the end of the day, that's what leadership is. Not commanding, not controlling, but seeing potential and nurturing it into reality, with patience, with wisdom, with unwavering belief that people are capable of extraordinary things when given extraordinary trust. That was the lesson of Fort Richardson, and it was a lesson Sarah would never forget.